I was lucky enough to be the site director of the Excavations, and I will be talking about them today. So we'll start off with why the site as Bucklersby House is famous, and that obviously involves the Temple of Mithras and the discoveries by Professor Grimes in the 60s of the temple itself. I'll briefly cover that, because I'm sure most of you know the details of it, but it is worth repeating because it's such a great story. And a bit about what's happening to the temple now. And then the main meat of it really is going to be about what we found over our 3-year project that we just recently finished, detailing finds through the complete Roman sequence really. And at the end, a very tiny piece of post-Roman London archaeology, which we don't normally talk about, but because you're not all Romanists, I thought we should be a little bit of late medieval archaeology as well. So this plan here shows this composite map really of London in 200 AD. Obviously the site is within the Red Ring. And the interesting, or the most important thing about it for archaeologists is that it straddles the Walbrook River, which was the main topographical feature of the Roman town. And it rises in the hills above Islington and comes through the city here under modern Moorgate, through London Wall, culverted under London Wall, and joins the Thames at Dowgate, just to the south of our site down here. As well as the Walbrook coming through the site, we also have Watling Street through the south of the site, and we're at the very southern edge, we're on the southern edge of the main east-west road of the Roman town as well, so we're right in the middle of the city. But to start from the beginning of the modern project, if that makes any sense, the story really starts on the 11th of May 1941 with the huge destruction of the city during the Blitz. The picture on the right shows St Stephen Walbrook Church on the left, looking down Walbrook, and our site is on the right-hand side of this picture, and most of it was completely destroyed by bombing. The picture on the left has been misattributed in the past as being further down Queen Victoria Street towards Blackfriars Station. Actually, it's on our site, and it's, if you know the city, it's opposite one of the banks on Queen Victoria Street now, and it's just a chance photo taken by one of the fire inspectors walking through the city of the collapse. So the Gold Insurance Plan is a fantastic resource for people that work in London. They, since the mid-19th century, record all the buildings and properties and people that occupied all the buildings in the city. And they did obviously post-war ones because they were planning the rebuilding of the city. And here's the 1958 one, which shows our site. This is Cannon Street here, to the south. Walbrook, the street with St Stephen's Church is up here. And our site is bounded by Queen Victoria Street up this way. So you can see that pretty much the whole thing is destroyed. Now, not one to pass up an opportunity, obviously, the Royal Society of Antiquaries set up the Roman and Medieval London Excavation Committee, led by Professor Grimes, to put strip trenches across many of the bomb sites in the city. Apparently the medieval bit was only added after some complaints. It was going to be just Roman, but it became Roman and Medieval London Excavation Committee. And they set trenches across our site, east-west trenches, cuttings, in order to get a section through the Walbrook stream. The Walbrook was known to be a source of great preservation of artefacts, and particularly Roman artefacts. So the intention was to see if they could record a section across the stream in the midst of all the rubble. Fortuitously, there was only one cellar which was empty of rubble in 1952, and this is a picture of that cellar. Grimes put his trench, his cutting, through these cellars, and in one of the easternmost cuttings he found obviously the curved end of a building, an upside end of a Roman building. It was decided at this point that this building needed to be fully excavated, or at least excavated to a greater degree than a couple of weeks rapid digging, so it was agreed that they'd come back in 1954 and do a larger excavation. And here's a lovely aerial photograph of it. This is the wall that they found in their cutting. The cutting runs down here. There's St Stephen's Church. It's a wren church. It's got a really lovely smaller dome on the back. This is a Starbucks now, which I'll make no comment on. But the Temple of Mithras, this is the Roman temple that they unearthed. And obviously they didn't know who it was a temple to until the last day of the project, as every archaeologist knows. It's bound to be the last day, when one of the workmen on site unearthed a muddy piece of marble from a spoil heap. And it turned out to be, of course, famously the head of Mithras. And here is poor old Grimes gripping desperately on to the head of Mithras as well. Sir David Eccles, who's the Ministry of Works at the time, shows it off to the press. And the reason that this is such a famous story is not only because of the Temple of Mithras and Grimes found it, but on the day that this was found, the Sunday Times photographer was walking past the site, having to take a picture of of this muddy piece of marble, and it was in the news the next day, and it became a cause célèbre, as you all know, and 400,000 people visited the site. The police were called to control the crowds. It's only over a 2-week period. Huge public interest in the Temple of Mithras excavation, partly as a reaction towards what people thought was the destruction of old London, building all these new tower blocks. Long story, very short. Basically, they were allowed to have a little extension, a couple of weeks extension on this major monument of Roman London, and we think we have it bad these days. So Grimes and his volunteers and Audrey Williams worked steadily and very incredibly hard, and lots more statuary came up, and they unearthed the entire plan of the temple and excavated the floors within the temple. So we have all the phases of the building itself recorded beautifully in great detail by Grimes. And of course it turns out that in the 1880s, during sewer heading works, they'd actually found the Turoctomy of Mithras, which is would have been on the altar, in front of the altar, in the temple itself. And it hadn't been attributed to any particular building in the 1880s because they didn't know the Temple of Mithras was there. But this is pretty much from right next door. And the reason that all the marble survives is because the Temple of Mithras was only used as a mithrone for a few decades, and it was probably converted to a temple for Bacchus, we think. And all the statuary, the heads were removed, the Mithraic heads were removed and buried very carefully under the floor. Hence we have them preserved today. And they're in the Museum of London. They're one of the best assemblages of Romano-British marble. As I say, there was a huge furore about this. Churchill was recalled from Chequers, no less, to discuss it in Cabinet Office. And the issue was there was no way that this could be preserved in situ. The Bucklersbury House project was already ongoing. It was cost £8 million to build the new building, which at the time was the most expensive development in the city thus far. The pressure was on, obviously, to rebuild the poor old city after the war and get workers back in. But who on earth and what was going to be done with this poor temple to Mithras? The quote on the left is actually from Grimes. It's from John Shepherd's monograph, and they're worrying at this point about who's going to pay for the removal of the temple. Eventually it's decided that the fabric can be dismantled and removed and brought back to site, reconstructed as a temple to Mithras somewhere else in the new development. As you can see, the Corporation of London are still not doing very well out of this, but they've done very well recently, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So here's a picture of, again, Paul Grimes standing watching the temple being dismantled. It wasn't dismantled by archaeologists or stonemasons or conservators or anyone like that. It was dismantled by the piling contractors, and it was taken to the concrete contractors' building yard in New Malden in Surrey, and where it languished for a couple of years, and all the columns were stolen and ended up somewhere in New Malden, presumably in rockeries in people's back gardens. But eventually it was brought back, and it was reconstructed on the site. Again, Grimes, poor old Grimes again. He was completely kept out of any discussions about how the reconstruction is going to happen, about the levels, the appearance, the interior design of the reconstruction. And you may remember, some of you probably saw it, it ended up as a sort of crazy paving, rather sad thing, at the wrong level, wrong alignment, wrong position, wrong everything really. But nevertheless, for 1961, it's really nice, important early example of archaeological reconstruction. And it's a piece of Roman London that survived, fairly intact, let's say. So this is the building that we haven't, the constructors have just knocked down and are building their new building on top. And the story obviously is continuing because as part of the planning condition for the new development, the Corporation of London cleverly, as well as requesting, I should say, that the developer funds the excavation and publishing of any archaeology that's going to be impacted by that new development. They also requested the new developer to fund the dismantling of this reconstruction, which by now is a Grade 2 listed building, by the way. And the preservation of it and the design and the reinterpretation of the Temple of Mithras in a new display space on the site in its original location. So it was very carefully, using diamond tip chainsaws, dismantled over a period of several very cold months over the winter in 11 and 12. And this time it all went back. Everything that we had, we know definitely ended up in the storage yard this time. And interestingly, within the core, there was lots of medieval masonry. There was a really lovely medieval column base in it that someone obviously just used to try and make the building look bigger. But there was also tons and tons of concrete as well. And as we speak, my colleagues and colleagues at the Corporation of London, Bloomberg designers are working on the new Temple of Mithras, and in 2017 it will be open as a public space where we can all go and look. And here, this is probably well out of date now, and all the design details and things are sort of confidential from me, but it'll be underground. It'll maintain and retain the Mithraean idea that you are going underground to worship, and it'll be sort of a subterranean space with interpretation and displays and everything else that you'd expect in a modern display space of a major monument. And just this is a picture of the new building, and you'll be able to walk down Walbrook past St Stephen's Church and go in at lunchtime and have a nice 20 minutes, hour, whatever, looking at the temple. But on to now. This is 2012, I think. There's St Stephen's Church there. The Temple of Mithras obviously was right back here somewhere, and then it was over here somewhere, and now it's going to go back over here. This is the main area of excavation under here, under this roof. This must be a wintry time of year. But it's a huge area, and most of it was destroyed in the 1950s. This is looking the same way, but closer up. There's St Stephen's Church. This is a 1955 cementation picture. We're lucky that the cementation crew on site at the time took photos of absolutely everything, including, by chance, in the background of all their piles and everything, lots of archaeology sticking out at the section at the back. And we're looking eastwards, and we're looking at the section of the Walbrook stream. And now we're looking south, we're looking down the Walbrook stream, so we're looking towards the Thames. St Stephen's Church, which we've just seen, is on our left, and the Thames is down here, obviously, so we're looking pretty much down along the bed of the Walbrook stream, hence all that water. And the question says, what was left after 1954? Well, the answer is really very little. Everything to the right-hand side of this picture, pretty much, so 95% of the site was bulldozed, taken away in bulk, and dumped somewhere in the Thames estuary. Luckily for us, because Grimes had finished by this point, the Temple of Mithras was about there. Bits of it had sort of subsided into the Walbrook. The temple was there-ish. Ivan Noel Hume, another fantastic leading archaeologist in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, was working in London as a young man doing a thankless task of rescuing what he could, planning timbers as they popped up, and buying artefacts from the workmen at lunchtime, that kind of thing. And I think it's about 18% of the Roman Gallic Museum of London is actually constituted of finds of just saying Bucklersbury House on them, because they're so spectacular that they deserve to be in the museum. But all we know is that they came from that goo, that lovely Walbrook goo, and we don't know exactly where they came from. But there's a little bit left. Everything on the left of the picture was left for us to come back to. And significantly, another thing that the Corporation of London requested of the client was that because they were building this huge new block in the city and it was going to increase the footfall and the pressure on transport and everything, that they would have to put a new entrance in to Bank Station. This is going to be a new entrance off Walbrook straight into the Waterloo and City line, which means it's going to be very deep, which is great for us because it means all the archaeology in the way needs to be excavated. So this is what we call the LUL box. It just means London Underground Limited box. It's our shorthand, really. But this is the main area of our excavation. It's this person here is standing where the previous photograph was taken. So she's not looking down there, but if she was looking that way, she'd be looking down the bed of the Walbrook. So we are on the eastern bank of the Walbrook here, and the Walbrook is running this side of us. St Stephen's Church is up here still. What we're looking at here is a huge engineering project, as you can see. Walbrook is a medieval street. Bucklersbury is also a medieval street, and they have no significant foundations underneath them. If you step out of St Stephen's Church onto Walbrook, you are standing on the edge of the Walbrook Valley, and we know from sites we dug, this site up here, to the immediately east of us, that there's a 2.5 metre drop in topography. So that the valley slope is significant in such a small area. So basically they were very worried about Walbrook sliding in on us. Hence these huge sheet piles all the way around. These aren't pipes, these are props keeping the streets in. Because we started up about here. We started 4 metres below street level, maybe 5 metres, and ended up 9, 10, 11 at some points metres below street level. So it was very deep in a very small area. And as I say, that's the record-breaking bit of the project, really. All these 14,000 artefacts, 80,000 hours, some of them at night in the rain, obviously. And significantly, my favourite one is that only 1.3% of them are non-Roman in date. 2 prehistoric things, and all the rest are kind of a mixture of later medieval and post-medieval. And again, the significance is that this is all wet, waterlogged deposits. And not only are they waterlogged, but they're significantly compacted, laminated, that they're anaerobic, so there's no oxygen getting in, which is perfect preservation for metal objects and organic objects as well. So we have perfect preservation of things like leather and wood, but also the metalwork comes up really shiny and beautiful. So just to reiterate where we are, this is a bit of a closer in really. There's Watling Street running along the south of the site. Here's the main east-west road, and the Walbrook's running down here. And again, just a closer up one, really, to show that, which I'll go on about. So one of the main issues that we were studying, one of the main objects of the research really was the Walbrook itself. How did it change during the early Roman period? How did the Romans influence it, and how did it influence them? There's talk, well, it's constantly under discussion really, but whether the Walbrook formed an early western boundary to the Roman town in the early pre-Boudiccan period. There is activity to the west of it, but nothing of any status, any significant organisation of anything to the west of the Walbrook. So at the moment we didn't find any evidence of any serious construction going on to the west of the Walbrook on our site either, although we did have some quite nice early Roman activity on the other hill, on the western side of our project. There was nothing to suggest anything of any importance was going on, equivalent to what was going on the eastern hill anyway. But the other thing that we were looking at, and it's a constant issue, has been a constant discussion again with the Walbrook, is if the tidal reach of the Thames would allow this guy on his boat to come up the Walbrook as far as our site and to offload goods, come into contact with the main east-west road in the Roman period, for example. Could it have been used for transportation of goods? The quick, easy answer is no, it couldn't actually. None of the geoarchaeological sampling we did had any evidence of salt water or brackish water or estuarine sediments at all. And actually the work we've done on the flow coming downstream suggests that really it wasn't deep enough or strong enough, and the tidal reach wasn't high enough either. So we're not looking at a waterway that was used for transport or trade or anything like that, maybe on a very minor scale, but certainly seasonally it might have been deep and relatively fast flowing, but it wasn't a significant watercourse. And I mentioned the waterlogging. Well, obviously we had a lot of archaeology to get through very quickly, even though there were lots of us on site. So we borrowed a mudlark, a metal detectorist who's worked with Mola a lot in the past. He worked on the Guildhall excavations, and he's worked a lot on the Thames foreshore excavations as well, the waterfront excavations I should say. And he came along and he had a very good methodology of pre-excavation scanning and then post-excavation scanning of spoil. And this is just a 10-minute bag full that he found. And the thing about Pat, this is my favourite thing, really fantastic acorn-shaped amulet in the middle there. Lots of waste, lots of coins. The really fantastic thing about Pat, though, who's a metal detectorist, is that he was using his eyes as well as his detector. So you can see that there's ceramic things in there as well. And actually, we had an assemblage of writing tablets, and a lot of the writing tablets came back with MD for metal detected on the bag. And obviously you don't metal detect writing tablets, but the metal detectorist found the writing tablets because he was looking at all the deposits that came up so closely. So apologies for the rather rough plan in the top left, but we have no pre-Boudiccan activity of any import on our project. No buildings, No, nothing really. That dates to the pre-Boudiccan period, apart from a few things going on in the river, maybe little attempts of revetting, a few pits going on, that kind of thing. Probably because we're in a muddy hole to the just below the bridge actually. And as I said, this topography slopes so significantly that people wouldn't really have necessarily wanted to live in this little spot next to the river. What we do have in about 62, 61 is that a series of banks and ditches are constructed. At least two, although they are multi-phase, so there's two distinct, I'm calling them enclosures, but that's not the right word, two occupation areas within banks and ditches, but they are both multi-phase, so they are rebuilt and redone and that kind of thing. And within one of them there's evidence of metalworking, and a few small stakeholes that may suggest a temporary structure. We're not talking about houses, there's no beam slots or big post holes or anything like that, but certainly there's activity going on of a probable industrial nature. I'm going to say probable a lot. We haven't actually done all the analysis for this project yet. This is quite early days, but we saw it. There's a half there. I saw that with my own eyes. So, again, it's hard to say. I'm reluctant to say what's going on here, but this could be a sort of immediately post-Boudiccan fire attempt at a kind of a retreat into an area that wasn't burnt, hadn't been burnt. We had no evidence of the fire either on our site at all. So it wasn't burnt largely because there's no buildings there, obviously. So this is a small sort of area of quite intense activity immediately after the Boudiccan fire. And along with all that intense activity, there's a lot of military evidence. And I really hesitate to link these two things because we're not talking about a camp or a fort or anything like that. In fact, the military evidence could just be maybe they were making, maybe they were producing metalwork for the military, that kind of thing. It might just be background noise from dumping. However, lots of these things were found in those banks and ditch enclosures, including these fantastic in situ groups of harness gear, which have never been seen before because they are held together by a leather thong, which normally deteriorates, rots away in the ground. But in the waterlogged deposits of the Walbrook Valley, the thong was preserved. So we have these fantastic pendants here at the bottom, or one of them at the bottom there, and then the leather coming up the back. And they're held together by, they have melon beads, and then they have these little spacers of iron called ferrules. And ferrules and melon beads are found together a lot, but we've never had evidence of why they're found together, and this is why, obviously, because they're part of a harness gear. And this is tombstone from a French tomb, actually, but it shows the horse wearing exactly this thing. So a significant amount of military activity. Immediately after this phase, we have a huge intensity of use of the Walbrook, or use of land next to the Walbrook, I should say. There's revetting, there's these fantastic wattle fences, which have earth behind them, so they're not only fences, they are almost like mini revetments, really, I suppose. There's a wooden platform behind here. We saw, some of us who were here earlier saw a great picture of it wasn't great, it was a picture of an inhumation with a pile through the middle. Well, we had the same problem on our project. We had hundreds and hundreds of 1950s piles going through everything. And here, this one goes through this lovely late 60s AD wooden platform. And underneath that wooden platform was a little, was an adult skull lodged underneath. This is one of these Walbrook skulls questions, really, whether we think it was lodged underneath because it had washed down the river and the river had flooded it and become washed in, or whether it was deliberately put under the platform. We'll probably never know, but it was there. So as I say, the military phase, or the phase with the military finds within it, finishes by 70-ish. Certainly all done by then. And the city by now we know is being rebuilt rapidly. There's major investment, organised rebuilding, and we have these, because we're on such a slope, as I say, there's a 2.5 metre drop, these fantastic crib structures are built, timber cribs, plank boxes pretty much, with, again, because of the preservation, we had the pegs surviving and the uprights of the walls surviving. Basically they're just there to level the ground to allow you to build a house on top, or a building on top, not necessarily a house. The example in the top left that the woman is cleaning had steps going down into it, timber steps going down into it, which presumably would have been utilised during the backfilling. They're backfilled with very homogeneous clay, presumably dredged up from the river next door or from the immediate locality because it was really heavy. And under lots of these, most of them, if not all of them, there were nice foundation deposits of pots. This is a Mortaro, obviously. That's a really nice ring and dot beaker that was under the floor of one of these buildings. Had another one that had a jar within the actual wall structure itself. But this leads us on to the late 1st century, like I say, the boom town of London, really. The economic might is moving on. And this is a picture I've stolen from Number 1 Poultry, which is just over the road from us. We haven't had our reconstruction drawings done yet, I'm afraid. We're down here in the muddy bit near the bottom. And we know now that that boat shouldn't be there because it wasn't navigable. But this is just to show that the archaeology on Poultry is very similar at this stage to the archaeology on our project. Road, so we have the road frontage to the north of us, and coming off the road are these typical rectangular clay and timber strip buildings with shop frontages at the front perhaps, and then industrial and domestic activity out the back, and living quarters as well for people that were coming into London. And the early assemblage of finds actually from our site is pretty much all imported. There's very little native pottery or other types of finds from the early assemblages until you get to about now, when, as the Industrial Revolution, people came to work in the growing city, growing town, I should say. So this is a plan. The Walbrook's over here now, and the crib structures we saw were sort of in the middle here. This is just to show the preservation of timber, really. Again, our road is up here, so these are long, they're perpendicular to the road. They have their short axis against the street frontage. This is the building, the room within a building actually, this one here, that had, I think, 15 fragments of writing tablet within it, none of which had any writing on, really annoyingly. But that would suggest that they were being processed there, or somebody, whoever was using this room, had a stash of writing tablets for his or her, probably his profession or job, whatever it was, that would involve some form of literacy. And it also had 11 styluses, styli, and a couple of really nice seal boxes as well. So we are, from the finds assemblages at least, able to hint at functions for some of these rooms. I said that lots of the early, well, most of the early archaeological finds certainly are imported, and lots of these styles of woodwork and architecture were continental as well. I mean, you would expect that, I suppose, in a new town full of immigrants. But at this stage, there were roundhouses being constructed elsewhere in London, so there were locals coming in. But on our project, this is quite a confusing slide. This is a later wall that's truncated, and this really nice wall here is what I wanted to show you. So it has really hefty oak, damp-proof really, coursing on the bottom, and then within the actual brick earth, the actual clay wall itself, instead of using typical sort of tile coursing like you'd see in Roman buildings, they've got these planks that run all the way through, so they've got timber coursing really within the wall itself. And Ian's hand here is on a really lovely opus signinum floor, and there's a little sort of hearthy area behind him. This is in one of the smaller trenches we did, but in 3 of the trenches we have most of this building in plan, so we can piece it together eventually. Another thing that we had lots of, oops, they are kneeling down, they're not standing up. It wasn't that spectacular. Another thing we had lots of were these fantastic fences, and I've cheated a bit. This is actually the same combination of fencing. We're looking north here, Ian's measuring the baseboard of it, and we're looking up towards the top of site. But you can see that these are incredibly well preserved, very, very thin timber, oak pale fencing, hewn oak pales, and our woodwork specialist thinks they're probably created off-site and brought to site ready-made, really, like you'd buy a fence panel at B&Q and just slotted in to between the uprights of the fence. And this actually is about 2 metres to the west of the modern street Walbrook. And both of these, this again, also this land boundary, this property boundary has persisted to today. So from the year 87, I think, that dendro for this board here, to 2014, 2015 we'll now have the same land property boundary all the way through. And behind all this nice Roman oak fencing, we had a bit of native species sort of hammered on the back for extra strength. Now obviously we're next to the river, so it's pretty wet, even though there's not much evidence of flooding in the later 1st century, because the Romans, as I say, they built these crib structures, these boxes, to build up the level of ground, and in about 89 or something, 90 AD, they put a metre of dumping across the whole area. So they imported a metre's worth of material, pretty much 100% stable sweeping. So somewhere in London there's a huge stables we've yet to find. But again, the implication is that might be related to the army, perhaps if they had cavalry near the fort at this stage. But anyway, homogeneous dumping of a metre depth. And the drainage, therefore, it didn't flood, but because we are in a wet country, they needed drains, obviously. And the other thing is that they're probably not actually for fresh water. These might actually be foul water for industry and other less pleasant things. Drains of all kinds, though. These are really nicely supported on beams, oak beams. This is a really lovely one with the lid still surviving. You can see how far Bucklersbury House concrete got to in 1956, to within 3 millimetres of the top of that Roman timber drain. It's amazing it survived. The L-shaped ones, drains that turned right angles. This is probably a drain to catch water from a gutter, because this little iron collar here fed into a larger tank, maybe for washing clean water, that kind of thing. So we had, as I said, typical rectangular Roman buildings, and in the middle of them we had this fantastic circular structure. These are modern piles again, you have to sort of pretend they're not there really. It's lined with lovely woven wattle, and inside the walls are brick earth, really baked clay and tiles. This is collapsed, this wall, but you can see the dome at the bottom of the picture there, and we can reconstruct the height of the dome. And when we found it, obviously we were talking about whether it was an industrial small kiln or whether it was for lime. There's no evidence of any high temperature or anything like that on site though, so it was decided, and this is a bakery, but on a rather large commercial scale. An interpretation that's further confirmed by the discovery of these in the wall. These are the earliest evidence of cockroaches from Britain, I'm happy to say, which came over from the continent on a boat of grain, presumably, and were milled perhaps in London somewhere nearby, and ended up in the walls of our nice warm bakery, and then only lasted one warm period before they died in the warm we found them 2,000 years later. But the bakery continues the theme of this area being not entirely domestic in function, and the directly later phase, again, continues that really. This is a terrible picture because you have all these horrible engineering props in the way, but a lovely plank floor. This is running north-south for a significant distance, with brick earth walls here and here. It burnt down, so the brick earth is scorched, but nevertheless you can see it's a really large building. It has a we're still arguing about whether this cut is deliberate, but there's a cut in the middle of the floor. There's also a timber-lined feature running down this side. Now, we had thought that it might have been a mill, not a tidal mill, because we're 4 metres above the Walbrook at this stage, even in the Roman period. But it could have been, people hoped it might have been a mill using water from the Walbrook diverted somewhere through Roman London. There's no evidence of this huge diversion of water through Roman London, of course, though it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because if there was evidence, it would be under Bank Station in the Bank of England, and pretty much all gone. But the mill experts that came and looked, and certainly Dr. Bob Spain, who's the sort of Roman Empire mill expert, came and looked, and the levels, unfortunately, of this, which we thought might be elite, are far too shallow for it to have fed any kind of wheel. So we're looking at other interpretations for this large industrial complex. But that, as I say, that building burns down in a significant fire, as does much of the site. I've used Hadrianic fire on the slide, but of course there were probably hundreds of fires around London in the 120s AD. And the pottery actually doesn't suggest a specific Hadrianic date for this. So need to scrub that. Major fire and subsequent rebuilding. These are the buildings we saw in one of the trenches earlier. They collapsed and were buried in situ, or were buried immediately after. So we had in situ collapse of wall plaster and in situ wall plaster still surviving on the bases of these walls within this room within this building. But in common with much of the rest of London really at this time, now that they don't need to use, they have a supply of stone, they can now rebuild their houses in stone. So we have two rather large properties, again on the same alignment, so their narrow end is up towards the road, and they're long down parallel with the Walbrook, but two rather nice large ragstone buildings. Not much internal deposits survived from them because of the truncation later on, but we have very little, none, horizontal archaeology from the 4th century and none from the 5th century either. We did have cut features, but we have no surviving later Roman stratigraphy, as you would expect. But this is a nice oven out the back of both those buildings had ovens. This is the nicer one of the two. And there's a road between them. This road leads down towards, at this point, the Temple of Mithras was constructed in 240 AD. So this road is leading down in that direction. Whether it's leading to it, we have yet to be brave enough to say, but of course this is contemporary with the Temple of Mithras, and it's just next door to these people. And although there's the idea that Mithraism was a secretive cult, actually it's quite a public place where it is, and quite often Mithrae were put on the back or associated buildings of large townhouses or villas and things like that, so it's not as secretive as we might perhaps imagine it was. This is also next to the road, a really nice piece of external tessellated floor. Again, it's with stake holes in it. It's tempting to say this was some kind of roadside shrine as you head down to the Mithraeum. Don't want to go too mad with that kind of interpretation. And this is a later feature, a really boring drain, really captured the tile. But when we excavated this drain, it turned out to be a really lovely decorated imbrex tile. This is really rare. There's only one other, I think, in the British Museum, and it comes from a tilery in Chichester, sort of renegade tilery, as our CBM expert said. And there's a few things it could be, but my favourite interpretation is that it's used to fake columns in your house. So you would stick this up against your wall, obviously with the curved end outwards, and then you would paint it over as if it was marbled. So you would have marble columns within your Nouveau Riche Roman ragstone villa in the city. I said we had cut features from the late Roman period. This is really the only one, the most significant one anyway. This is the construction date of this well from the timber dating is very, very close to the Mithraean construction as far as we know. So we're talking 230, 240-ish AD. So it's in use as well during the early years of the Mithraeum. And then much later, it gets backfilled, deliberately backfilled at the bottom with all these fantastic things, a horde of vessels, someone's fine tableware set, pretty much. 50 coins and a really nice late Roman belt set which has military connotations, although again that may be coincidental. And lots of lead tank and pipe fragments decorated with scallop motif, and 6 or 7 cow skulls. So this is a typical well closure deposit for a well. Once you use the well and you've had the water, you deliberately poison the water really and say thank you, that's it for the well. Quick one about the community engagement. Another really great thing the Corporation of London did, and I know Catherine is here, I'm not honestly saying because you're here, I was going to say it anyway, but as part of this huge development, the developer were requested to fund some community engagement as part of their project as well. So we had money to do blogging and interviews and talks like this, and huge hoarding all the way down Walbrook, which we provided the images for, Lots and lots of community archaeology, trips onto site, weekends, lectures, all that kind of thing. No community archaeology on the site, so obviously, because we're in this horrendous commercial site. But the best thing really was the Oral History Project, which you might have heard about if you're local on the radio in London. It was on. Because the discovery of the Mithraeum was such a famous thing, and we know that so many people went to see it, obviously we knew that people would still be around who would remember it, or who had parents or friends who would remember it. And so we sent a call out for them all to contact us. And we interviewed lots of them, and we had lots of new things, and people brought in ephemera, so people bought tickets they were given in the queue, people bought bits of pot they'd found on spoil heaps, all sorts of things, including a lady called Mithra, because her pregnant mum went to visit the site when she was pregnant, which is quite sweet. Lots and lots of really great stories about that, and it's significant. The theme that ran through it all was that it was old London, and London was being rebuilt, but that old London was really a valuable thing to the locals, really, to the Londoners. I just want to briefly touch on the medieval period, though. This is a really fantastic story as well, even though it's a tiny assemblage, one feature pretty much. Queen Victoria Street, so obviously it's Victorian Street. It was bashed through the medieval street pattern in the 1880s when Bucklersbury pavement, the mosaic, was found actually up here somewhere. But Bucklersbury is named after Buckle family, who were rich wool merchants from Somerset, Frome, I think they came from, and they had a couple of Lord Mayors within their number. The Lord Mayor Mansion House is just here, so he still lives just next door. Actually, he hasn't moved far. St Stephen Walbrook in the medieval period is on our site, and we did find some foundations that probably did relate to the church and associated buildings. It's now on this side of the road, largely because it fell into the river, much like the Temple of Mithras had done 1500 years before. But the Buckle family had this huge property called, and it's later called the Barge, but anyway, it was divided up after they left in the 12th century, and it was divided up into tenements. And in the early 16th century, Thomas More lived on this property in the Barge. And it coincides with the date of him publishing Utopia, so obviously we think he wrote it while he was sitting on our site. And Erasmus visited it, and his property became a sort of centre of intellectual life in the city of London, really, in the Tudor period. This is a picture of him. Holbein did a painting of his family, but he only did the sketch. This is someone else sort of finishing off Holbein's sketch, really. But as we all know, Thomas More was executed by Henry VIII. Not personally, but and his son lodged a court case in 1554 to try and evict some people who'd moved into Thomas More's estates on our property. Now, this is the site in the Tudor period. So here is the Barge property up here, and here are the gardens behind the Barge where Thomas More may have perambulated of an afternoon. This is Walbrook here. Cannon Street's down here. So we're thinking, and our excavation area actually encompassed a fair bit of the Barge's back garden, really. And within this backyard area, we found a well, and in it was a nice metalwork assemblage, a spur. This is a rondel dagger, apparently. The woman that found it does jousting at the weekend for fun, and she recognised it straight away. It's a dagger that would have been used in jousts and presumably in battle as well, because it pierces through the eye slits of a Tudor helmet. But it's a really fine thing, and because again, preservation, we have all these composite objects that preserve metal and wood and bone as well. And also within it, a really nice pottery assemblage. Now, I confess these aren't the pots from the well, because we haven't photographed those yet, but they are the exact same fabric and form. So they do look like the ones we found. And this, also within the well itself, there were huge copper alloy bowls as well. And ladles, axes, all kinds of kitchenalia, really, I suppose. And as the Jackie Pearce, our post-medieval pottery specialist, has said, discarded waste of a household of reasonable means, and the date is 1500 to 1550. So I'm going with it being Thomas More's kitchen. And that's reasonable at this stage. That's a tiny, like I say, one feature of the non-Roman assemblage that's of any import, really. The rest of it's very much background, unfortunately, because we're right in the middle of the city through the whole of its period, the whole of its history, obviously. But that's where I'm going to finish, with the Tudors. Thank you.